Good evening and welcome to another edition of Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker and I am joined this evening by Aaron Bastani, contributing editor and co-founder of Novara Media. How are you doing?
I'm good. I was just saying, I hope you enjoyed your weekend. I hope you enjoyed a sunny Sunday. I certainly did.
I sat on my balcony trying to get as much vitamin D as I possibly could. I am also joined by Lara McNeil, who is incredibly placed as a guest right now on this show because not only is Lara McNeil the youth representative on Labour's NEC, one of the leading voices of the Labour left, but Lara is also one of the, I think, about 6,000 people in the country who are final year medical students and whose graduation is being fast tracked so they can join the front line in the fight against COVID-19. Which covers, incredibly, the two stories that we're going to cover today, which are Keir Starmer becoming leader of the Labour Party and the announcements he's made as to his new shadow cabinet, and the latest on coronavirus and the battle against it. How are you doing, Lara?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yeah, enjoy.
You're working today, right? Every time you come on the show, I feel guilty because I've just been reading the news all day and you've been out helping.
Well, no, that's not going to be true. But yeah, today we were sort of training. We're waiting for our registration officially as doctors to come through, although we've graduated. So we're just sort of doing bank shifts as nursing assistants and basically what roles we can do. Because obviously we've got a lot of skills, but it's hard to place us. And the NHS are really struggling for staff as the key resource now. So. Yeah,
I suppose briefly, some people might be worried, the fact that the government has fast-tracked final year medical students. Does that mean there are a bunch of people who didn't, get time to revise for their final exam and now are going to not really know what they're doing? Or are you?
No,
is it almost a sort of technicality?
Yeah, basically, I did my finals in January. Others do them later, but they basically do them around now. And then I went abroad to Cuba for 8 weeks as an elective placement, and then the only placement I had left was a kind of a bridging module, which didn't contain any exams, and it's just clinical practice, the same as all our modules in third, fourth, and fifth year. So there was no more exams to do. It was just more practice, and this is obviously going to be more practice for us in the earlier on. It's only a few months anyway. We're going to start in August. So
this is like a kind of the ultimate placement on a medical course, isn't it? You're really getting thrown into the heat of the fire with a global pandemic, the worst in a century.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about that in detail later. Anyway, let's get on to the Labour side of your life. We're going to talk about Keir Starmer's new shadow. You what?
My two personalities,
your two personalities. Which is more chaotic at the moment, actually?
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't know, both similarly.
Labour's probably, politics is always more difficult, I'd say. Now there's a pandemic, that's a little bit hard to choose.
But let's go through Keir Starmer's big shadow cabinet appointments. Well, all of his shadow cabinet appointments. So yesterday, the Big Five were announced, and these were, I suppose, called the Big Five. One, because they include the offices of state, but also they form part of his coronavirus task force. Actually, six, I think, because it includes the health secretary. There will be Angela Rayner, who is elected deputy leader of the Labour Party. That's not his choice, and has been made chair of the Labour Party, so she's replacing Ian Lavery. Annalise Dodds is in as shadow chancellor of the Exchequer. Lisa Nandy is shadow foreign secretary. Nick Thomas Simmons, who a lot of us had to spend a while reading his Wikipedia page this weekend, who will be shadow home secretary, or now is shadow home secretary. Rachel Reeves, shadow chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a position none of us had heard of until Michael Gove got it in the middle of last year. And Jonathan Ashworth, who keeps the position of Shadow Secretary for Health and Social Care. So they'll be on the coronavirus task force. I'll go through some of the other roles that were announced today before we discuss it. Also, let's go through them. We'll get up the next slide. So we've got David Lammy, who's going to be Shadow Justice Secretary, John Healey, Shadow Defence Secretary, Ed Miliband, Shadow Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary. So he's taking over from Rebecca Long-Bailey. Emily Thornberry has been moved into Shadow International Trade Secretary, replacing Barry Gardner. Jonathan Reynolds into Shadow Work and Pensions. Jonathan Ashworth, I've already said, is retaining his position as Health Secretary. Rebecca Long-Bailey being moved from business into education. Joe Stevens is going to be Shadow Digital Culture, Media and Sport. which for a while was Tom Watson. I think most recently it was Rosanna Allen-Khan. Lou Haig, who's going to be Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary. She's been brilliant throughout the whole coronavirus crisis. Rosanna Allen-Khan's moving into Shadow Minister for Mental Health. Makes sense for her to be in that Shadow Health Ministry, considering she's a doctor. Marsha de Cordova is Shadow Women. Nick Brown's remaining the Chief Whip. I think he's been Chief Whip under 4 leaders now. I'll go to you first, Lara. As you probably know more of these personally than either me or Aaron do. How do you feel about these announcements today and yesterday?
I think it's a mixed bag. Like, I'm definitely, obviously, I didn't support Keir to be the leader, but I'm also not under the illusion that him and his shadow cabinet, or his tenure over the Labour Party was going to be sort of Blairite era. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. I'm happy with Angela Rayner, obviously, as chair of the party. I would have loved Ian Lavery to stay, but I think that's Angela will be good in that. And obviously Rebecca Long-Bailey having a fairly prominent position in education is important. I think the key thing here is he's brought in, he's obviously got rid of more of the left of the Labour Party and then brought in people like Ian Murray and other more centre-right of the Labour Party. So I think it's clear there's been a shift. I think a lot of people have committed to keeping the same policies. I'm very happy with Annalise Dodds as Shadow Chancellor. I think she'll be good because she was part of John McDonnell's team. She's committed to the anti-austerity kind of policies that John McDonnell championed. So I think we're seeing some of that sort of, I guess, the new centre of Labour as Corbyn has shifted it on things like austerity and public ownership. So I'm kind of like waiting to see what people do. I don't want to second guess too many people until they've developed on their brief. But in general, I think he's probably been a bit too generous to like the right and the centre of the party compared to how many members there are. I think obviously it's devastating that Becky lost, but she got like 27% of the vote, right? Like, you'd think that there's more justification to have more self-professed socialists in the shadow cabinet. But, you're not going to get everything. And I think I'm a bit disappointed in Ian Lavery and John Trickett going as well, and Annie McDonald being moved from transport, just because I think they represent the areas that we did so badly in. And I'd like to see that Keir's moved away from his sort of ultra Remain stance, which I think he got so badly wrong in the election. So, yeah, I think he's still going to face some big problems, but it's not overall awful.
I suppose his sort of Brexity cover is Lisa Nandy, right? Giving her a good promotion. Because there was a period when the first people he'd sacked were John Trickett, Ian Lavery and Barry Gardner. There was a bit of a concern that he was just going to get rid of all the anti-PVers and it be the sort of new Remain campaign leading the party. But I suppose getting Lisa Nandy in there as Foreign Secretary offers some reassurance.
Yeah, I think it's good that he offered the other leadership candidates positions. Like, I wrote an article in Labour List saying that that's what he should do. I think that that's a good sort of show of unity. I think with the people's vote stuff, it's not just pro-people's vote and anti-people's vote, is it either? I think Brexit is such a complicated issue, especially on the left. I don't know about Lisa Nandy. I think it was more like the electoral impact of it, which obviously she was right about, that people were pro-leave. But I think Ian and John really had like an analysis of the EU a bit more in terms of a left-wing sort of Benite perspective and how it impacted like organised worker struggle and also nationalisation and things like that. I haven't seen much evidence that Lisa has that sort of analysis, sort of Alexit analysis. So I think that he is missing a block of the Labour Party there, but we shall see.
Yeah, I suppose he hasn't got any proper Lexit people in there, has he? We've got some breaking news, which we'll probably discuss in more detail in the second half of the show. But Boris Johnson is in intensive care. So on that, we found out last night that he was going into hospital. The line from the government was that this was, for tests or for observation, primarily because, well, we all know he was positive for coronavirus, but he had persistent symptoms, so they didn't go away. But the news is now, but yeah, the government was saying, he wasn't in a serious condition. It was just that it was persistent. Now we've found out he's in intensive care. So we'll talk, in a moment about how that might affect the government's response to coronavirus. Of course, anyone in this country, whoever they are, if they get coronavirus, I wish them a speedy recovery, regardless of what they might have done in the past or the present. Aaron, I want to go to you about these shadow cabinet appointments. What did you make of Keir's decisions about who would form part of his team?
I agree with what's just been said from Lara. It's a centre-left shadow cabinet, and it's it's a good reflection of the composition of the Parliamentary Labour Party. But ultimately, the Parliamentary Labour Party doesn't reflect the party's membership. Ultimately, the party constituted as MPs at Westminster doesn't reflect the last two policy platforms that the Labour Party has run on and that Keir Starmer has committed to in terms of what he promised to become the party's leader. Furthermore, I agree with Lara in that there are no people with a particular analysis of Brexit. Lisa Nandy was pro-respecting the vote, but that's because she was in a Leave seat. And I do think it's strange when a policy position was taken, which cost the party many, many seats. This was always predictable. I always said Labour could win more votes adopting people's vote position, but losing more seats. Why? Because 2/3 of Labour seats were Leave seats. 2/3 of Labour target seats were Leave seats. The electoral calculus was never there. The people that said that most explicitly and most trenchantly were John Trickett and Ian Lavery. They've gone. The reason they've gone is because of clashes, basically, with Keir Starmer. And they did clash, but they clashed because they were correct. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I would say that is like I've already said, a centre-left, a soft left shadow cabinet. But this is as left as you'll find this shadow cabinet in the next couple of years. It will drift right because of the institutional kickback from big business, from the media, big party donors coming back, the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party, commentators. That will all ensure that the party drifts further right, unless the left becomes organised, can put up slates for NEC and internal elections, which aren't ridiculous, aren't fragmented, as we've just seen, which can actually formalise and recompose the left as it was around Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell between 2015 and really 2019. If it does that inevitable rightward drift won't happen. In the absence of that, this is the most left wing that you'll find the Labour shadow cabinet under Keir Starmer. An important part to say, though, on top of that is, I've been, how can we put it, a critic, I hope, a friendly critic. This shadow cabinet is more left wing than Jeremy Corbyn's first shadow cabinet. So people mouthing off and saying, oh, they're right wingers, oh, they're melts. Jeremy Corbyn's first shadow cabinet had Hillary Benn, Bomber Ben, it had Seema Malhotra. It had all kinds of people whose politics were generally speaking to the right of the centre of what the shadow cabinet now is. So I wouldn't be too downbeat about it, but also don't be under any illusions about the scale of the challenges ahead and how the shadow cabinet will only go further right if there isn't a strong left, which doesn't just run through the membership, but aligns members, left trade unions, left institutions, and most importantly, left MPs, what is presently called the Socialist Campaign Group.
And so I suppose the positive vision for Keir Starmer, and I think this is where one can take hope from his appointments, was that he would be the Ed Miliband that Ed Miliband always wanted to be. So Ed Miliband was a reasonably left-wing fella, as we've all seen since he stood down as leader of the Labour Party. But when he came into power, all he was hearing in his ear was, you've got to move right, you've got to move right, you've got to move right. He was the most left-wing person in his shadow cabinet. And what did that ultimately meant? That Labour was forced into a position of austerity light. All of the things which made Ed Miliband interesting, he dropped because he didn't have any confidence to believe that potentially you could run on a left-wing platform and do well. And this cabinet, Keir Starmer's cabinet, does seem significantly to the left of what Ed Miliband chose back in 2010. And there are some interesting positions. I mean, Ed Miliband, his shadow chancellor was Ed Balls, who was definitely far to the right of Annalise Dodds. Who was Shadow Foreign Secretary under?
It was Hillary Benn.
Under Ed Miliband?
Oh, no, sorry, I thought it was about Jeremy Corbyn. Shadow, oh my God, that's such a good question. Well, his first Shadow Chancellor was actually Alan Johnson. People forget.
Wasn't it? And then he moved to Ed Balls.
But then Alan Johnson was in post for like a month, which was just absurd.
Lisa Nandy's an interesting choice. I mean, me and Aaron were talking last night about how, in terms of her foreign policy positions, it seems like an odd choice. I mean, there's an awful clip of her talking to Robert Peston it was the Jewish Labour hustings, where, to be honest, Rebecca Long-Bailey says the same thing, but they both sort of defer to Robert Peston that it's racist to even criticize, it's racist to call Israel's policies racist. Like the most bizarre position to adopt. Also in the race, we saw her, I think it was in the Channel 4 debate. No, it was in the Andrew Neil interviews, wasn't it? Where she said that we should learn from the Spanish dealing with Catalonia when looking at Scottish independence, which, didn't seem like someone who's got a brilliant grasp of foreign policy. But it does make sense to me in the context of Brexit, because one of the main things that you'll be talking about as Shadow Foreign Secretary over the next 4 years is our relationship with the European Union. And I think it is helpful to have someone having that conversation that's not an ultra Remainer, even if they're not someone who's as Lexity as Ian Lavery or John Trickett. I don't know, Lara, do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think what you were saying about Ed Miliband earlier is I think that's the inherent contradiction of having someone who's sort of a social democrat on the left, and then when they get into that position of power, they realize that the coalition they're holding together and the makeup of the PLP at that time. So I think that's it's always going to happen. I think moving to the right, unless you're so strong in your sort of principles, yeah. So that's why I'm saying wait and see for Keir, because I think things could rapidly change.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone because you do know more of these people personally than us, Lara, as someone who sits on the NEC, anyone you're particularly excited to see show their stuff that maybe our audience might not have their eyes on? Any ones to watch?
So we've got 3 of the representatives on the NEC, new ones, to replace John Trickett, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Diane Abbott now. So that'll be good to get to know them, because I don't know any of them. I think, and having Angela Rayner join the NEC as well will be great. I wanted her to be deputy leader, and I really want to see what Angela does in terms of chair of the party, because I think there's still a lot of unfinished business. For me, Keir still has the same problems as Jeremy. He has the media, who may be united to him now, but the goalposts always change. He's still got the issue of mobilising the base. There's a lot of members say they might leave, some might come back, the membership might change. How are we going to deal with the extra parliamentary left? How do we mobilise trade union members to join the Labour Party? Jeremy was praised a lot at his last NEC for making that bridge between the trade unions and the Labour Party. So I think Keir still faces some of those problems, and Angela is sort of in the role as chair of the Labour Party to do that. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. I mean, I would really say as well on the shadow cabinet as a whole, like you were saying about Lisa Nandy, I think her Catalonia comments were worrying. And I think the shadow cabinet doesn't scream internationalist, kind of anti-imperialist to me, because our whole international debate has been focused around Europe so much that I feel like we have missed out on some other sort of international issues. So I kind of want to see where that goes. And I think that might be something that the left might have to fight a lot on, to get sort of international issues on the agenda, anti-imperialism on the agenda, and fight for us to take strong positions on things, because we have lost some of the most outspoken people in that area from the shadow cabinet. Can
I be quick? Because obviously I think we're going to move along probably more quickly than we would have thought, what with the Prime Minister being in intensive care and Dominic Raab all of a sudden becoming the de facto Prime Minister. I just want to say that I think the foreign policy thing's a big one. And for me, the reason why Lisa Nandy was chosen as Shadow Foreign Secretary initially, I find it bizarre. I've never heard her mention foreign countries with the exception of Catalonia and Spain. And it was a bizarre thing to say. There's 2 reasons. Ben Judah, a very sharp guy. He was the first person to say that Joe Biden could be neoliberalism's Brezhnev. He was saying that he viewed it as a way of, to an extent, neutralizing the overhead, the kickback that Labour will be getting from the media when she goes into the Today programme, goes on Newsnight, goes on BBC Question Time, and they talk about Israel-Palestine. And she can do that in a relatively fair way because she is head of Labour Friends of Palestine, but she's also been very trenchantly opposed to perceived anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So I think for a lot of people, foreign policy as a sphere of policy is basically shorthand for what they view as the quote-unquote toxic parts of the Corbyn agenda, the Corbyn years. They're happy to adopt much of the domestic agenda foreign policy less so. And so I think it makes sense in that context that one of the more right-wing figures of the shadow cabinet, Lisa Nandy, she was the candidate of the right in this leadership race, takes that position. It's primarily about appealing to the Today programme rather than somebody who may actually take the role if Labour were to form a government, which I don't think she would.
I want to get up a couple of tweets to show some other reactions to these picks. One of them is Sebastian Payne. So he's a political journalist at the Financial Times. So he tweets today, mixed reactions in Labour to Keir Starmer's new shadow cabinet. One MP says he's brought the left and right together without offending anyone. That's quite a feat. But another senior figure says it's the dregs of the Brown combined with the mediocrity of the Miliband era. I mean, to which you can only assume that this is a sort of begrudging Blairite on the backbenches, because I think what was most positive about this shadow cabinet for that Keir Starmer has chosen, other than the fact that it promotes some really good people like Annalise Dodds, is that he hasn't promoted the most obnoxious partisan hacks, like the Jess Phillips, the Wes Streetings. I mean, they might all get junior front bench positions, but that is quite different to giving them, a senior shadow cabinet position. And a lot of them will be pissed off. And you also have to remember how much sort of pressure there was from the media. And the assumption, actually, there was this assumption that when Keir Starmer's leader, of course, he'll put Rachel Reeves as the shadow chancellor of the Exchequer instead of the shadow chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster or whatever it is, and that he'd promote Jess Phillips or Wes Streeting or Yvette Cooper, Hilary Benn, and those people, as we speak, have stayed on the backbenches, and some of them might be pissed off. Let's now go to Emily Maitlis, who I suppose isn't happy, but also was just shocked. She was shocked. So she replies to Lewis Goodall's tweet, which is announcing or listing the people who've been appointed to the shadow cabinet, and she writes, "Reckon we are still waiting for Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips, Stella Creasy. What's happening there?" I mean, you've got to remember that this is supposed to be an impartial BBC journalist who is shocked because her bezies haven't been put forward to become part of the shadow cabinet. I mean, you couldn't really make your allegiances to a particular form of politics, which is a sort of media-savvy, bland centrism that's represented by Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips, Stella Creasy, and the whole of Change UK, to just assume that they must be being put into senior positions in the shadow cabinet. I mean, this does give. So I say there's two reasons why this is potentially positive. Is that if you're seeing that the Labour right are already being catty and briefing against the Labour left, briefing against Keir Starmer, then hopefully Starmer will see that he needs an ally in the left to make sure that he isn't constantly briefed and plotted against by Ed Miliband, because you've got to remember that Ed Miliband faced a lot of internal strife. Less than Jeremy Corbyn, but Jeremy Corbyn had people who went out to bat for him. Ed Miliband ended up with few allies in the party and no one really to fight his cause. So hopefully Keir will recognise that he needs the Labour left for him not to get dragged down by the Labour right, even if it probably is in this point in time in his power to completely exclude the left. I think that would be bad in the long run. Should we take hope from these? Well, I suppose from the Blairites briefing against Keir, and from Maitlis's shock, and from the exclusion of people like Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips, and Stella.
Can I just say, with regards to the exclusion of Wes Streeting, maybe we can get that Maitlis tweet up again. Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips, and who else was it? Stella Creasy. Jess Phillips couldn't even get the nominations to get on the ballot to run for leader. She couldn't get the nominations from CLPs. She couldn't get the trade union backing. Who precisely is she representing in the Labour Party beyond herself? Wes Streeting's been an MP he's only been an MP, I think, since 2015. He's never held the role of any seniority, whether it's in government or in the shadow cabinet. Stella Creasy's been a great single issue campaigner, but again, you wouldn't really class her as a political heavyweight. What tenor of her politics is reflective of the membership more generally? So, I mean, like you say, Michael, this is who Emily Maitlis would like to see in the shadow cabinet. There's no reason for any of these people to be in there. Jess Phillips couldn't get 35 CLPs to put her on the ballot. Why on earth should she be entitled to a senior role? She hasn't earned it.
That tweet's funny, isn't it? Like, it just shows the kind of where the centre ground in most sort of media class people's heads lies, when that's just not reflective of the membership, the country at large, or any of the reasons that we lost the last general election and where we need to go forward. I think Keir's got pros and cons in the fact he hasn't really put his flag in the sand, really. Like, Jeremy knew where he was and who his, like, you know, the other side were, although obviously that's not the best way to put it, and that's why there was a lot of division. But because Keir's got this a bit of ambiguity, it's a benefit to start with. It means that he can start making these serious coalitions, which I think are really, really sensible. You know, the Labour Party is a broad church of socialists, social democrats, trade unionists. So he does need to bring that together. That's why I'm optimistic about it. But I think, yeah, the Labour left does play a really important role in this. And we've shown that we're a big part of the membership. And I'm glad that there are some figures in there in the shadow cabinet. And we just need to see how much substance the words that he's saying at the moment actually hold. It's quite hard to make a proper analysis of it now.
Can I just say one thing, Michael, before you go any further? Because I know you don't often follow the YouTube numbers. We've got 2,357 people watching. We've only got 469 thumbs. Before you do anything else, doesn't cost you a penny. Smash the like button. Huge disparity there. 2,366,471. Smash the like button. And also click the subscribe button. I won't do any more calls to action. I'll leave that to Michael.
Oh, I'm going to come in with another call to action now, because you are watching Novara Media. You are watching Tysky Sour. And as you know, this channel, this organization is only powered by our members. Not our members, sorry. I'm getting confused. Where am I talking about, the Labour Party or Novara Media at this point? Our subscribers. As you know, we ask for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you are already giving us that, thank you very much. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Even if you are already subscribed, you might want to pop there, either up your subscription or give us a one-off donation. So we can expand, so we can keep doing these shows as regularly as we are doing them at the moment. And we'll always start them crisply. I'll always have the right microphone plugged in and my headphones attached. We had a bumpy start to the start of this show, if you weren't tuned in at that point. Let's go now to the breaking news, which is that Boris Johnson has been moved into the ICU in hospital, so into the intensive care unit. I'm going to read out the number 10 statement. This is the official Downing Street statement. Since Sunday evening, the Prime Minister has been under the care of doctors at St Thomas's Hospital in London after being admitted with persistent symptoms of coronavirus. Over the course of this afternoon, the condition of the Prime Minister has worsened, and on the advice of his medical team, he has been moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. The PM has asked Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who is the first Secretary of State, to deputise for him where necessary. The PM is receiving excellent care and thanks all NHS staff for their hard work and dedication. And the PM's, this is not in their statement, but also brief, the PM is understood to be conscious and was moved an hour and a half ago as a precaution in case he needs ventilation. I should probably go to you first, Lara, as a doctor. How should we interpret this? Does this mean it's necessarily, very serious, or could this? How much do you accept that this would be a precautionary measure?
So I think it could be. I think what they know about coronavirus patients now is that they can deteriorate quite rapidly. Obviously, you saw the Prime Minister clapping on the streets, and then now he's in hospital and ICU. So that's a bit, if he's conscious, that means he's probably not being ventilated yet. If people's oxygen requirements are going up quite high, then they tend to take them to ICU to preempt the deterioration so they can best support them. But obviously we know people are going to the ICU and coming out and recovering. So they might be taking extra precautions based on that. I'm sure he's getting very close monitoring. But yeah, it must be very scary. Having seen patients on ICU, you've got to have a whole human side to it, really. It's not a nice place to be. It's a very intense place to be, one-on-one sort of nursing, and obviously he's got a pregnant partner, so it's a bit very, very kind of shocking news. But now Dominic Raab's in charge. Great.
What does it mean? Maybe you could explain sort of to our audience what it means to be moved into ICU, because there's a lot of terms that we've sort of instantly become, comfortable. Just say, oh, they're in ICU. Oh, it's a vent. Everyone's learnt the lingo, which is that there's an intensive care unit, which is where you go when it's serious, and there's a ventilator, which is what you might need if it's serious. But I think there's potentially stages of care in intensive care unit, and what practically happens that at least I'm not particularly clear about. So if what would be happening to someone who's just been sent to ICU?
So in normal cases, I think ICU is normally if one or two of your organs need support. So whether that's your heart needs support through giving adrenaline, or your lungs through ventilation, or your kidneys through renal replacement therapy. In terms of coronavirus patients, it's preempting, I guess, the deterioration and then needing to be on a ventilator. And in obviously serious cases, then it can lead to multi-organ failure. So they can support your other organs there. ICU or ITU, it's the same thing, I think. I am very wary. I'm a very junior doctor at this stage. And basically it's one-to-one nursing care. You're getting all your observations done, every 15 minutes or every hour. So they can monitor you for deterioration, and you have the healthcare staff close, whereas you can't have that on a ward. You're not going to necessarily see staff that quickly. So that's basically it.
Aaron, I suppose it's fairly unprecedented in the middle of a national crisis where the government has more decisions to make than ever. I don't really like it when Laura Koonsberg is on the TV saying this is unprecedented and the government are having to make unprecedented decisions, and sort of poses that as political analysis. But it is sort of undeniable that the government are under intense pressure at this point. So it is quite unprecedented for, in a moment like that, for a leader to be taken out of action and be in intensive care. Or is it not?
No, it's not. Churchill had pneumonia twice during the Second World War.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
I mean, look, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, couldn't use his legs for most of his full terms as US president. I'm trying to think of more recently in Britain. Who was it? Wasn't Macmillan? It was Anthony Eden was very sick, but then he was also a terrible prime minister. So yeah, there are a few examples.
I thought JFK was supposed to have a sort of like delusional fever when the Bay of Pigs was launched, and that was sort of one of the explanations as to why it was a flop.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing. I mean, but in terms of a decent comparison to this, yes, we were at war in the Second World War. Churchill had pneumonia twice, which may be what Boris Johnson has right now. And yeah, it's obviously best wishes to him. Hope he recovers quickly. But what's interesting is the line that was coming out of Downing Street yesterday was, it's totally normal. It's just a checkup. Right now, hospital beds are gold dust, right? Unless it's absolutely urgent, people aren't going to hospital. So for the Prime Minister to be going to hospital indicated it was very serious. Oh, he's just staying in for tests, etc. Given capacity in the NHS is stretched right now, that was completely counterintuitive. And so my suspicions were that was just nonsense, and that actually was probably in a bit of trouble. If you follow Lewis Goodall on Twitter, great journalist at BBC Newsnight, he's a healthy skeptic. He's not a conspiracy theorist. And he was kind of insinuating the same thing. And it's troubling that the media and 10 Downing Street wouldn't even be relaying accurate information about the Prime Minister's health. They were saying until a few hours ago, he's leading the government. And now he's in ICU. Now, I'm not saying this to make sort of political capital out of it, but it does reveal a certain modus operandi with regards to relaying information to the general public in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, which often isn't particularly truthful. And that's concerning because people need to be in receipt of the facts. The worse this gets and the longer it goes on.
There's a particularly, I suppose, strange element to, I mean, we often talk about how the media isn't as critical as it needs to be in ordinary times, but there is something about coronavirus which has sort of put the media into national emergency mode, as they would in a war, which again we'd be incredibly critical of, where it seems like they do especially feel their role as one of reassuring the public and getting the messages across that the government want to get across, and they even more explicitly than usual sort of see themselves as one arm of governance, as opposed to, the fifth estate that's meant to hold power to account. They've now become a sort of lever for crowd management, as it were. I suppose we should talk quickly about, Raab is deputising for Boris Johnson. So at this point, he is, he's standing in as Prime Minister. I'm somewhat dubious if that makes him actually the most powerful person in Downing Street at the moment. I feel like he's not necessarily going to be the one who now makes the final decision, as it were. It doesn't seem like he's been the most influential person during this coronavirus crisis. He gave the press briefing today, the 5 p.m. one, and I have to say he seemed very awkward to me. It didn't seem like he was particularly confident, sort of, and on top of his brief when it came to coronavirus. So I'm not really sure how that will play out. We should maybe, though. Anyone any more? You want to come back in on Boris Johnson, or should we go to Keir Starmer's first outing on Mar? Any big thoughts on Raab taking over for a while?
He's so right wing, isn't he?
He is very right wing.
That's my only thought. He's written quite a lot of, libertarian-y stuff.
He's kind of, he's a Randian. He's like Sajid Javid. His whole ideology is the productive side of the economy is the private sector.
Yeah.
The extractive side, the useless parasitic side of the economy is basically all the jobs right now that are keeping society ticking over. Refuse collection, hospital workers, etc. The upside down, topsy-turvy economy that we have, where the most important people get paid the least, is kind of, the right-wing libertarian utopia that people like Dominic Raab sort of really aspire for this country to live up to. He was one of the people involved in the Britannia Unchained book, and that is his politics.
Yeah, he's one of those figures where I suppose when Boris Johnson got elected, there's often talk, he's a liberal, he's inherently against authority, and is also, unideological, and people sort of see him as potentially he could move in a red Tory direction. But Dominic Raab is one of those people who's heavily promoted around. No, but also what I'm saying is why that. One of the reasons that story always seemed a bit dubious is because of the number of people who Boris Johnson had promoted around him, who were of the extreme free market Randian wing of the Conservative Party. So that's the Priti Patels, Dominic Raab, Liz Truss. All of these people are
Sajid
Javid. All these people are very much in favour of sort of like an ultra neoliberal politics, which in some parts, there are some strands of that sort of hard right economic vibe. I'm going to call it, it's not a very political scientist word to use, but that kind of hard right economic vibe. They are some of the people who are sort of saying let the elderly die in the United States, for example. And what Boris Johnson was kind of going for about 3 weeks ago. But I assume that Dominic Raab's predilections for reading Ayn Rand won't necessarily mean that our coronavirus policy takes a dramatic U-turn. Let's go briefly to, because we've got a couple of clips here as well. Let's go briefly to Keir Starmer's first outing as leader on Andrew Marr yesterday. So we talked about what his shadow cabinet picks tell us about his politics. But probably, the main determinant of how successful Keir Starmer will be as leader of the Labour Party, what his political instincts are, is what he personally does under scrutiny, sort of how he. What his political instincts are when he's asked to, scrutinize the government, how he reacts to a grilling on television. And his first outing was yesterday. I want to go to a couple of clips from that. The first is one that I thought was pretty reasonable. He was asked, should Labour join a national unity government?
We've got to be constructive. We've got to pull together, support the government where it's right to do so. But asking those difficult questions matters. You can see that when the difficult questions were asked on testing, things began to move. Same thing with equipment on the front line. So scrutiny is important here, because if scrutiny points out mistakes that can then be put right, it's achieved a very important thing going forward. But not opposition for opposition's sake. I'm not going to score party political points.
So, I mean, I saw some people on Twitter sort of focus on that I'm not going to do opposition for opposition's sake, and sort of suggested that meant that Keir Starmer wasn't particularly interesting in opposing the Tories. I actually sort of, in terms of that particular clip, have a different take, because I thought he did articulate very well why the Labour Party shouldn't join a national unity government, and in a way which I think most people watching will be like, yeah, that is actually what an opposition should be doing in a time of national crisis, which is scrutinising the government. And he gave very practical examples of how opposing the government had made material changes to their policy on coronavirus. And prior to that, he had also sort of criticised them for the herd immunity strategy and for being a bit shit on testing. I'll go next to a clip where I personally thought he was pretty awful. I'm calling this the worst of Keir.
I will have in my shadow cabinet those that want to serve towards the future aim of winning that next general election. It'll be a talented, balanced shadow cabinet. But what I felt yesterday very strongly was our party coming together and focusing on the future. And I think that's what matters. We're not looking back. We're not badging people by the past. We're going forward to the future, focusing on how we win the 2024 general election.
Forward to the future, not going back, blah, 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 banal truisms. Let's go to the clip it reminded me of.
We must move forward, not backward, upward, not forward, and always twirling towards freedom.
So I think that for me summarizes the best and the worst of Keir Starmer. The best is that, he can articulate a position which sounds, very credible to the public. He is able to scrutinize the government and, look prime ministerial in a moment of national crisis, whilst not giving the Tories necessarily a particularly easy ride. The worst of it is he, retreats into these banal truisms that anyone with any politics whatsoever could say. I know that you watched that interview on Mar. Did you still watch the Sunday morning political shows, Lara, or do you not really have enough time now? You're on the front line of the coronavirus crisis.
I try not to watch too much because I don't know, it's just too much politics. I think that clip did really annoy me, to be honest, and it's going to be hard because I'm not going to try and oppose Keir at every turn for opposition's sake. But that phrase, for opposition's sake, it's like, I don't think our role is to simply scrutinize the government. That bothers me as well. Our role is to set out an alternative and a socialist alternative. And I think the issue is now we are in a crisis. It's the key time where we have to be articulating, what another world would look like, how we solve and come out the other side of this crisis. I don't think simply scrutinizing the government and then sort of agreeing on when they're good, disagreeing on they're bad, sort of taking it on a case-by-case basis. It kind of sounds like the government's just leading and we're just following and checking they're doing everything well on the way, and when they're not, we'll tell them. It's like, no, we're setting out an alternative. And yes, when we set out an alternative, it will oppose a lot of what the Conservatives are saying because we are entirely ideologically opposed parties. So it's opposition when it comes up because your alternative is opposing what the government's doing. And I think we really risk not just obviously hemorrhaging the membership, but not coming back in these polls if we don't say, these big ideas. And I saw a tweet the other day saying, Keir needs to be careful about saying that we shouldn't demand the impossible demands, get into some of these old Tory attack lines of a wish list, because look at what the Conservatives have just done. The trade union movement was calling for 80% of wages, and that's what they've got. Now lots are calling for 100% of their wages. So we're in a crisis. Now is not the time to say we're simply going to scrutinise and follow the government. We need to be 3 steps ahead with a vision. He's got a new shadow cabinet. He's got a lot of old ideas from the old shadow cabinet, all the policy, all the manifesto we've worked on. Let's start from there and build an alternative.
Yeah, I thought a few things. I agree with what you just said, Lara. I think actually Labour, in response to the coronavirus as an opposition, given that Jeremy Corbyn is effectively, a lame duck leader of the opposition, I think they've been fantastic. Basically, Britain has got the same response as most of Western Europe. Now, when you consider that our politics and sort of policy direction is generally more to the right, that's a real achievement. That's a really big achievement, especially against the Tory government with a really big majority. So I think that's a real achievement. I agree with you. Demanding the impossible, what does that mean? Nonsense. On the other hand, I think when he said, I won't oppose for opposition's sake, I thought that was good. And I'll tell you why I think that was good. It's exactly what you have to say before you can then say the rest of the sentence. I'll give you an example. Rebecca Long-Bailey, the day that she started to run for Labour leader, should have gone to the nearest camera and said, I'm the most electable candidate. Because the first attack line is, you aren't electable. And then they'd say, you aren't electable. And you say, well, I want to democratise the Labour Party. Well, our policy more, nobody cares. That translates as, yes, I agree, I'm not electable. So the first thing that Keir Starmer says, whatever his response, and I thought the rest of the response actually was pretty good. Whatever he says has to say, we won't oppose for opposition's sake. Because immediately you're neutralising the default line of attack that will follow from your opponent. I mean, that stuff's just politics 101. And it's the kind of thing that Jeremy Corbyn didn't do enough. And that's not because of Jeremy Corbyn. I just think it was just the basic politics that wasn't really adhered to over the last 5 years. And that's not an ideological point. Jeremy Corbyn's politics were outstanding. They're the best of any Labour leader for 80 years. But that kind of stuff was reassuring. And I think the reason why it happened is, first of all, Keir Starmer's a lawyer, right? That's important. Secondly, he's 58 years old. And I think this is a really key thing that separates him from Ed Miliband. He knows what he believes in. He knows who he is. He's comfortable in his own skin. And he's just got that experience in a range of workplaces, a range of contexts over decades. Ed Miliband was basically a political apparatchik. I mean that in the nicest possible way, for 10 years before becoming leader of the Labour Party, which made him a very one-dimensional character. Now, Keir Starmer isn't charismatic, but in terms of doing a tick box exercise, in terms of formulating a response to a difficult interview, I think he's clearly head and shoulders above Ed Miliband.
I think you both have good points there, and I suppose my take from this is that saying you don't want to oppose for opposition's sake is good, and also you shouldn't oppose for opposition's sake. Why would you? We have enough. We should be proud. We should be confident enough in our beliefs that we're not just doing it we're not just making our arguments for the sake of it. But I think there's three roles that the Labour leader has to play in this particular moment, and I probably agree with Lara in that I'm not confident he is going to do all three of them. So one of them is to scrutinise the government and look more competent than them, and that's your first task, because unless you do that, you're not going to be taken seriously on anything else. The second one is, during this coronavirus crisis, you make sure that the Conservatives are willing to have no voice during this crisis. The frontline workers who aren't getting PPE, the people who are waiting in long queues for universal credit, the people who have to go to work in their non-essential workplaces because their boss are demanding them to go there because they care more about profit than public health. All of those people he has to be giving a voice to, because you're the Labour Party. The point is that if there is a sort of unequal outcome and suffering that's only hitting some people in society due to coronavirus, you should be there to stand up for those people, because they're not going to get to sit on Andrew Marr. And number three is to make sure that you create the space so that after this crisis, the Tories can't pivot and destroy any sort of social policies that we might think were positive during the time of the crisis, and even reverse them and do a sort of austerity maneuver like they did after the financial crisis. And that means that you have to be constantly, and not necessarily doing it in a sort of political point scoring way, but you have to constantly all the time be talking about how the people that are meaning that we can survive coronavirus are frontline workers, etc., etc. I'm talking about how you do need a state with significant capacity, and that has unfortunately been eroded over the last 10 years of austerity. And he's probably not going to talk about neoliberalism on Mar, is he? But sort of say the lessons we have to learn from this is that we do need an egalitarian state with a lot of state capacity. And yeah, he should say that. He should be more proud of that. I do think there's a danger with Keir that he gets a little bit afraid of his own shadow, which The Economist want him to do. I've just got two quotes I want. One's from The Economist and one's from the FT. So they're both the sort of tribunes of financial capital, but they've taken very different positions in terms of the political direction the country is going to take due to coronavirus, and different implications for what Sir Keir Starmer should do. So this was The Economist take on Keir Starmer becoming Labour leader. So Keir's best chance of success lies in playing to his strengths as a post-ideological pragmatist, whatever that is. In public, he should ask practical questions about the government's performance in producing ventilators and COVID tests or getting economic help to the vulnerable, whilst avoiding the impression that he's sniping. Behind the scenes, he should prepare for normal times by clearing out Mr. Corbyn's most scrofulous followers. I'll have to ask James Butler what that word means. If he bets on a new era of big government socialism, he will waste his political capital. So the only thing that the economists think Keir Starmer should be concerned with is getting rid of Corbynism. He doesn't seem to offer any alternative other than just asking questions. Seems a bit of a waste to me. Let's go to the Financial Times with their very different take. So the Financial Times, in a leader on the weekend, wrote, or I think it was on Friday, radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labour markets less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda. the privileges of the elderly and wealthy in question. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. So I suppose if you read the FT one there, you think even if Keir Starmer is a little bit timid, if even the Financial Times is saying this, presumably he's going to lean into that argument and sort of use or take advantage of the fact that the state is intervening and all the flaws of neoliberalism have become exposed, and use that to sort of continue some of Corbyn's legacy. Or you could think that he's stupid enough to follow the Conservatives' advice and basically just apologise for being the leader of the Labour Party and say, maybe I could be a better apolitical leader than Boris Johnson. I suppose predictions as to which ones you think he's going to take. What will determine which one he'll take? Because I do think it is up in the air. I don't think this is set in stone at this point in time.
I think which kind of road he'll take will depend on his strategy, which I don't know what it is, of dealing with the media. How sort of, because we've seen with his language, he is doing, as Aaron said, the politics 101. Maybe that is the right thing to say in an interview. He's more saying the things that Jeremy, on principle wouldn't say, and all those things, like all the Queen stuff. So it's just seeing how much substance that's backed up with. I think in this crisis, when you've got things like the Financial Times saying stuff like that, then, the status quo is kind of moved to the left in terms of government intervention. But obviously this is a short-term thing. So we need to see what sort of Keir's economic policy is going to be, or Annalise Dodd's economic policy on the after this all, which looks to be good. But yeah, it basically depends what's his plan with the media. It's got to be better than Corbyn's. That was probably one of the biggest failings. And I think people say, oh, that's just a cop out, they were mean. I was like, I don't think they had necessarily a strategy, for the media and what they were going to do with it. What were they going to do with the really hostile ones? What were they going to do with ones in the middle, etc., building a new left media? So it depends what way Keir's going to go with that, as to which way he goes.
No, I completely agree. I think, the first two pieces he wrote as Labour leader were in the Mirror on Sunday and the Sunday Times. And I saw people say, oh, it's behind a paywall, it's Rupert Murdoch. Well, the print edition of the Sunday Times normally sells about 600,000 copies. The Observer sells about 150,000 copies. So the Sunday Times is the serious newspaper on a Sunday. It actually relays important information. It actually has scoops. So it's worth reading far more so than the Observer. So I thought that to me was an intelligent thing to do. I think we probably all agree they're the two papers that certainly the Mirror on Sunday. So I think there's probably a relatively worked out media strategy early on. They're not lost at sea. And I agree with you, Lara. I think the big failure was the absence of a media strategy with Corbyn. Corbyn could and should have written for the Sunday Times. He just should. In my opinion, you should write for basically everybody except the Sun. Maybe not the Daily Star or the Express. Nobody reads them anyway. The Telegraph will never ask you. But other than that, everybody except the Sun. A few other things. On economic policy, here's the question. What does the Labour right actually want? What does Wes Streeting actually want? What does even Rachel Reeves is now having to pretend to be a Fabian centre-left social democrat. In an era, which is what we're about to enter, an era of 10, 12% deficits, they'll just do what they did after 2010 or after 2008, really, which is, we'll do what the Tories are doing, but like 20% less. Not quite as bad, slightly more slowly. That isn't going to work. That's certainly not going to win you a general election. Ed Miliband is the proof of that. And then finally, the difference between The Economist and the Financial Times is fascinating for me. The Economist, maybe we can pull this back up from Fox, the quote from The Economist from that piece. The Economist has existed since 1843. And it's saying Sir Keir's best chance of success lies in playing to his strengths as a post-ideological pragmatist. This magazine has been peddling overtly the ideology of free market capitalism as the best way to run societies and to reproduce economic life since 1843. And they have the temerity to say that somebody else shouldn't be ideological. Absurd. They are an ideological outlet. They often just write complete nonsense. They were supporting Bolsonaro last year. They often say just mad, zany things. On the other hand, the Financial Times is a newspaper for people who have to make money. It's not a publication for ideologues. And right now, capitalism is in triage. Capitalism is in the ICU. You've got very low rates of profit, very low rates of growth. You have had that for years. You've got declining political consent in the system across the world. You've got the rise of strongmen. You've got deglobalization. And in the middle of all of that, you have a pandemic which sees US unemployment increase by 10 million in the space of a fortnight, which sees 1 million people take out, or almost 1 million people take out universal credit in this country, which will lead to a bigger world recession than what we saw after 1929. The political after effects, which were, of course, the 1930s. And the FT knows that. The FT knows that in a way that The Economist doesn't, because The Economist, like I say, is an ideological publication. It's a free marketeer publication, which makes the point about Keir Starmer all the more amusing. But if you want to know the common sense for a lot of people right now, the powerful, the elite, I think you'd read the FT. And Lara's absolutely right.
Yeah, they love saying that the like they're not ideological, because they are capitalism is the status quo and anything else is different to that. And in the crisis, the opportunity for that all to change. Not that Ian Lavery was criticised for saying that it was an opportunity out of crisis, like he wanted the crisis to happen. No, but it's just the fact that the status quo is turned on its head in a crisis like this, an economic and a public health crisis. I think the space is there for the Labour left to have, as you said, Wes Streeting, Jess Phillips do not have even an inch of the answers to this. So that is exactly where the Labour left come in. And we have developed things over the last 4 or 5 years. People like to say that nothing's happened and the party hasn't changed at all. I don't think that's true. I think we've got lots of structures, lots of policy to sort of fill that space where the centre and the right of the Labour Party don't actually have the answers. And we need to be 3 steps ahead and think about what happens on the other side of this.
I mean, he also has to learn from Gordon Brown, right, Keir Starmer? Because if you think about Gordon Brown during the 2008 financial crisis, Gordon Brown dealt with that incredibly competently. Probably one of the most competent leaders in the world when it came to the 2008 financial crisis. Lots of people credit him, with not having a global depression. But he didn't seem to think particularly strategically about what are going to be, the lines of battle after this, and how do I lay the foundations to make sure that the political side that comes out of this strongest is the one that wants to refound social democracy, not the one that wants to roll back all that we have left of the state. And Keir Starmer needs to learn from that and not look at, because my worry, and I think he's got a lot of potential. I thought he performed well on Mar. My worry with him is that he's obsessed with the polls. And what that means is that he wants to look more competent than Boris every day. And that's all he's thinking about. But he needs to take the longer view, which is how do I make sure that everything I say is creating space for an outcome after this, which is more egalitarian and which has a state which is strong enough to inhibit some of the vicious outcomes of neoliberalism that we've seen over the last 40 years. And that doesn't mean, by the way, going on Andrew Marr and saying the coronavirus proves that neoliberalism is dead and we need some sort of socialism. It means being smart enough to work out what are the parts of, or what are the realities of this crisis that should be emphasized if you want people to come to progressive conclusions from it.
Yeah, exactly. Show, don't tell, as we always say. And I thought there was one line, really memorable line, which was very reassuring. And he said, for too long, people who've been at the back, or the workers, who get the worst possible deal, we're now saying they should get the best possible one. They should be at the front. It was a really nice inversion. And to me, that was like, okay, that's like the kind of evocative imagery that sticks in people's heads, which is great, very important in politics. But B, it's a really radical political message, which has been formulated in a really simple way. So I agree with you. Again, I'm not criticizing Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn has been, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important political politician on the left in this country. You could say since Tony Blair, was he on the left? I think him and Nigel Farage are probably the 2 most influential politicians of the last 15 years of British politics. So I'm not denigrating Jeremy Corbyn, but it's you don't need to say we've won the argument. Neoliberalism's been found out. You do need to speak in a lexicon and a register that everyday people understand. Now, Jeremy was great at doing that, strangely enough, in general election campaigns. Strangely enough, he was very good at doing that in leadership campaigns. Where he struggled was in the television studios, in the media, in the day-to-day political management of the Labour Party. I always said Jeremy Corbynism was always outstanding at political campaigns. It always failed at political management. And the question is, can you articulate those kinds of important messages in often a non-confrontational way, using quite easy to understand language, whilst doing the day-to-day political management of a major party with 500,000 members and lots of dissent? Very hard. I mean, if it was that easy, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't all have been gobbled up.
I agree that you shouldn't worry too much about what he says, which is kind of a weird thing to say. But like you say, with Jeremy, he's obviously been in his shadow cabinet and is respected him publicly or whatever, and is obviously he's got to kind of say things on telly that make a clean break with Corbynism, because otherwise then we're just going to repeat the media attacks on Corbynism again and again. So him saying things like, well, moving forward or whatever, although it's quite vacuous, like I kind of get annoyed with fairly vacuous statements like that. You do understand where he's coming from in that sense. And I'm not going to attack him for wanting to make a clean sort of break from Corbynism whilst taking the economic policies, the policies forward, because obviously that's what he's got to do. Otherwise, we are not going to be in government. But yeah, that's why it's all like, let's wait and see, because it depends how much of these political statements he actually puts into policy.
There were a couple of COVID-19 stories we were going to talk about and get your expertise as a doctor. But we've got all of that expertise, surprisingly, through a discussion of Boris Johnson's situation in hospital. So I'm actually going to park a social care story, which I do think is very important, to later in the week. And in fact, that works very well because on Friday, we're going to have Nadia Whittome, MP, on the show, who is not just a member of parliament, the youngest member of parliament, but has also, during this crisis, gone back to work in her old job in social care. So she's going to have a lot to tell us about the state of social care during COVID-19. I mean, we have mentioned it on the show before, the fact that the government took, so few precautions when it came to preventing COVID-19 entering the places where people are, the most vulnerable to it in the country. So they're not testing workers going into care homes. They're not testing people in care homes. They're not providing adequate PPE, personal protective equipment, for people going to work in those care homes. And the result is that you're seeing things like care homes where 16 people in the same care home are dying within a week. That was in Glasgow, but we're not going to go into that in detail, nor are we going to go into detail about the antibody tests. So the government ordered 3.5 million. They don't work. But we'll be back tomorrow, and I'm sure those will come up. What I want to do now, though, is go to your comments and questions on all of the topics we have discussed today. I'm going to go to Alan Kennedy's $5 super chat. American and UK centrists are again working in tandem with their pablum. Do either of my guests know what a pablum is? Keir sounded like Pete Buttigieg. What's a pablum? Aaron, do you know what a pablum is? Your vocabulary is broader than mine.
It could be. I mean, it's Latin. It looks like Latin plural, but I think it's more likely to be a typo.
In any case, I suppose the question is about is it? Oh no, it is a pabulum, a bland or insipid intellectual matter.
Pabulum. Oh, nice.
So I suppose they're calling Keir Starmer bland or insipid, like Pete Buttigieg. Do you think that's fair to either of you?
Do you want to go? I'm happy to.
I mean, Keir is a lot more left wing, isn't he?
Yeah,
that's just the truth. I think the American contest is just crazy to watch, isn't it? With Joe Biden just absolutely falling apart. But yeah, it's completely shifted to the right there. I think Labour is explicitly Democratic Socialist Party, whether or not that's true. I think that's another thing as well. I was going to mention with America, how much the Labour left really want a party. Sorry, the left in general want a party, a Labour Party. And then there's people talking, obviously lots of people have left the Labour Party or whatever. Don't know if it's lots, but that's another thing which kind of encourages me to stay in party politics, is seeing people in America. That's their long-term goal, to have like a Labour Party. And we've got that, and we shouldn't just take it for granted that we've got a party which is affiliated to trade union movement, So that's another thing. And watching them trying to sort of project the future past Bernie and all the rest, they've got a really good, I think DSA have got a really good way of like looking to the future, what happens after Bernie, if it goes well, if it doesn't, what's their plan, what's their strategy for a Labour Party. I think they're very good at looking ahead because they've been so marginalised for so long.
Yeah, no, I think we shouldn't overlook what we have in the UK and the gains that have been made. I thought it was a great Twitter thread today from a friend of the show, Ellie May. And, one of the consequences of the last couple of years of the kind of, not hegemony of the radical left in the Labour Party, but its ascendance, has been to kind of give a bit more form and a bit more shape to what the soft left actually believes. Before, you used to have people in the Labour Party who would call themselves Social Democrats, who didn't like Blair, who had a critique of the market, and yet they wouldn't, be particularly outspoken about limits on executive pay or bringing rail back into public ownership. Quite obvious stuff, low pay, in-work poverty. And now they're doing that. And so that's one positive thing of the last couple of years. And so I agree. I think if you compare us to the US, what does the left have right now? A couple of dozen MPs in Parliament, several trade unions, radical trade unions, several media outlets, several social movements / sort of left institutions, TWT, Momentum, etc. The left union, CWU, Unite, Bakers Union, and so on. And these could all, and there are others as well, Acorn and whatnot, and these could and should all scale in the next few years. And the left is actually very, very, very big. The left is still by far the biggest institutional actor in the Labour Party in terms of its membership, in terms of its institutions. It really is. It's very big. And so I wouldn't get despondent about this stuff. And I think, we'll see, but I think we're so far ahead of the US situation. And I think to compare, Keir Starmer with Pete Buttigieg is wrong. Keir Starmer's policy platform is Bernie Sanders, right? And I think often rhetorically, Bernie Sanders is obviously more radical, even arguably, than Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell. But I think that comparison of American to British politics doesn't quite work because of the historical kind of context. A Tory who defends the NHS is to the left of Liz Warren on healthcare. What does that mean? So I think Starmer and Buttigieg, that's not quite fair.
All right, I've got two more questions. I'm going to throw one to each of you. So for you, Aaron, Joel asks, will the absence of a myth like Labour caused the 2008 crash through overspending change the economic response to this pandemic?
Will the absence of a myth?
Yeah.
What, so people should blame the Tories for coronavirus?
No. So the argument is one of the reasons why the outcome of the global financial crisis ended up being, considered to be the fault of Labour overspending rather than the banking system was that, the right quite successfully found an explanation which put the left at fault. And presumably that's going to be harder to do with coronavirus.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to understand the biggest crisis of the last century is obviously the Second World War. Out of that came the consensus, which gives birth to solidifies New Deal, the Great Society, reforms of the United States, welfare state here, the NHS, etc. Planner state capitalism, Keynesianism, and at the same time, Ayn Rand, I think, writes The Fountainhead in 1944, 45. Hayek writes The Road to Serfdom in 44, 45. Those people then say, look, we now have a project to reassert the ideas of classical liberalism, individualism, etc. And actually, they set the tone in response to every crisis after basically the late 1960s. By the early 70s, with the oil crisis of inflation, stagflation, crises of the late 1980s, it was always, okay, well, that means more market. So 2008 wasn't unique. The right had successfully exploited every single crisis effectively since the Second World War, absolutely since the 60s. And I think in part that won't happen this time, not just because it's coronavirus, because actually I think they could if all other things being equal, but actually now we have an organized left, not just in Britain, but in many places around the world, in Spain, in France, in the United States, which can actually kick back and actually can offer an alternative. I remember in 2008-9, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, Britain had a recession of 4% in 2009. And, the TUC was saying, we want an alternative. And people say, well, what is it? And they go, give a better deal to working people. Now we have a political program. And that's really new. The left having a plausible political program, which we know has a massive constituency among the electorate. Labour got 40% in 2017. Sanders got more votes in the 2016 Democratic primary than anyone else ever, except Obama and Hillary Clinton that year. We know there are huge numbers of people that want to get behind this. So I don't think the right will take advantage of this crisis like it has historically, or it's not as likely to. But that's not some sort of iron law of nature. It's simply because the left, after a decade, is now getting organised.
Lara, the final question goes to you, and it's also written as a challenge. So this is from Money. Don't worry, it's not like an embarrassing challenge. Money Cannot Be Eaten says, why should a socialist stay in the Labour Party now? I have left today, but convince me to rejoin.
Okay. I think there's many reasons to stay in the Labour Party. I think the Labour Party is the most effective tool that we have in this country, to get short-term wins for the working class, but also to have the long-term goal of a socialist country and a socialist world. Again, I'll raise the point of other countries who don't have a socialist or a Labour Party, and they want one. For us to sort of give up on it, I think is sort of tragic. And I think there's a lot of solidarity between people in the Labour Party and people in like America in the DSA, and they get a lot of inspiration over what we do here. I think you have to be in something to change it. I think there have been changes over Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which mean that the party is more democratic in a lot of ways. And I think that we do have still a lot to say about the policy-making process. That's still not finalised. I couldn't be in a position that I am in if young socialists didn't stay in the Labour Party and vote for me. So I think it's really important if you want to sort of change it. That I was watching a Tony Benn clip today on Twitter where he says that about resigning from the government and considering it and saying that, to leave the Labour Party would to say that you thought that it was not the lesser of two evils anymore. And that's a very, very big statement to make. And I really do not think we have reached that stage. I think the Labour Party is a very unique thing in the fact that it's got the affiliation to the trade union movement. It's the parliamentary expression of the working class. I can't see any evidence in this country or other countries that smaller socialist movements have had electoral or much political impact. And I think this is the best way we can do it in a collective way. But that doesn't, obviously, it's the same thing as the trade union movement. You should get involved with that as well. If you decide not to join the Labour Party again, there's so much to do in the union movement, which you might find more fulfilling if you really disagree with the leadership of the Labour Party.
Okay, Money Cannot Be Eaten can tell us either on YouTube or on Twitter whether he found that answer persuasive and whether he will be rejoining when we end this show. But for now, we will be ending this show. So thank you so much for joining us, Lara. Always a pleasure.
Lovely to speak to you guys virtually.
Keep us posted how it goes, now that you're a doctor.
Well,
and congratulations for graduating.
I'm moving up. Thank you. I'm moving up to Hull in August. So if anyone's got some comrades around in Hull, let me know. That's where I'm going to be a doctor then. And
Aaron, always a pleasure.
My pleasure. I just want to quickly say about the Labour thing. Until we get proportional representation, doing anything else is a waste of time. You can do all the social movement stuff as well or either, but the left should absolutely be involved in the Labour Party.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you both for joining me on what has become an incredibly momentous political day. Not only do we have a new shadow cabinet, a whole new, face of the Labour Party, but the Prime Minister is in ICU. Obviously, anyone who is suffering, in fact, anyone who is in ICU for whatever reason there might be, I wish them the best. I hope they get better as soon as possible.
Very good hospital. It treats a lot of politicians because it's so opposite Parliament.
I suppose a lot.
Mum died there.
Tony Benn's mum.
Mum died there.
Was she a politician as well?
No, but they, it's a politician's area, isn't it? Westminster?
Yeah. Of course. In any case, you've been watching Tysky Sour. You've been watching Novara Media. We will be going live every night this week at 8 p.m. to, talk about the huge events which are taking place every day at the moment. It's really unprecedented times in political history. Good night.